The last thing I remembered was page 1, a single paragraph. The villain's Omega, nameless, disposable, described as the cold-eyed Duke's unwanted mate who collapsed at the palace gates and was left to die while snow buried him. No last words, no dignity, one sentence. Gone. I'd read that novel 3 times, wept for him twice, never imagined I would awake inside his body, already on my knees in snow, already bleeding, already forgotten, and standing above me, black hair in the winter wind, storm-gray eyes looking down at me like I was an inconvenience he had not yet decided how to handle, was Duke Calian Voss, the villain himself, the man who, in the story, simply walked away. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you are watching from and subscribe. The novel was called The Crown is Chosen, and I had loved it the way you love something beautiful that breaks your heart every single time. It was the kind of story that swept you into a world of espers and guides, of alphas born with devastating power and omegas whose touch could either heal or destroy. And it centered on the rise of Crown Prince Sylvian Ashvale, the golden heir destined to unite the fractured empire. The romance was sweeping, the battles were glorious, the side characters were vivid and full of life, and there was one character who appeared for exactly 1 paragraph on the very first page. His name was never given. The novel referred to him only as the Duke's unwanted mate, a fair-haired Omega who had been assigned to Duke Calian Voss through an imperial compatibility pairing, a bureaucratic match made without anyone's consent. The Duke, famously cold, famously ruthless, the Empire's most powerful esper with no known guide match, had simply refused to acknowledge the pairing. He had never met his assigned mate. He had filed paperwork to have the bond dissolved, and when the Omega had traveled to the capital to plead his case at the palace gates, Duke Calian Voss had not come out to receive him. A palace steward had delivered a single written message. "Your presence is unwanted. Return to your province." The Omega had collapsed in the snow outside the gates that same night. No one had come. The novel's narration had described his golden hair fanning out against the white ground, his pale hand reaching for something that wasn't there. And then, in the novel's exact words, the unwanted one faded quietly, troubling no one further, and the story moved on to its true heroes. I had thrown the book across my room the first time I read that paragraph. I had picked it up again an hour later because the rest of the story was genuinely extraordinary. I had lived with the guilt of loving a novel that disposed of an unnamed Omega in its opening lines for 3 full years of my life. And then I woke up as him. I did not wake up gently. I woke up mid-collapse, my knees already hitting the cold stone of the palace's outer courtyard, my body weak and trembling in a way that told me this was not the beginning of the illness. This body had been deteriorating for days. The cold had already worked its way into the bones. The blonde hair I saw falling across my face when I blinked was matted with ice. My fingers, pale and slender, were curled against the flagstones, and they were not responding well. In the novel, this was where the paragraph ended. This was where the unnamed Omega simply lay down and stopped. I was not going to lie down and stop. I was a 26-year-old literature graduate who had read this novel 3 times and taken meticulous notes on the political structure of the Empire, the hierarchy of Esper rankings, the rules governing Guide Alpha pairings, and the detailed history of House Voss. If I was going to survive being dropped into the body of the character who existed only to die on page 1, I was going to need every single piece of that knowledge. The first thing I did, even as my body shook and my lungs burned with cold, was lift my head. The second thing I did was look directly at Duke Calian Voss. He was standing exactly where I had always imagined him. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in dark riding clothes still dusted with travel. His black hair was longer than the illustration suggested, falling past his jaw in wind-tossed strands. His face was all hard angles and absolute precision, the kind of face that looked like it had been carved specifically to make ordinary people feel inadequate. His eyes were the gray of deep water before a storm, and they were fixed on me with an expression I could not immediately read. In the novel, he had not been present for this scene. He had been inside the palace, deliberately absent. The steward had acted on his standing orders. Something had changed. Either the transmigration had altered the timeline, or there was something in the novel I had missed. I did not have time to work out which. My body chose that moment to make its distress emphatically clear. The pain that had been a dull background roar since I woke up sharpened into something sudden and savage, and I heard myself make a sound I had not intended to make. Not a cry. Something quieter and more desperate than that. Calian Voss moved. I had braced for nothing. I had told myself he would turn away. That was what the story had always said he did. but he crossed the distance between us in 4 strides, dropped to one knee in the snow, and caught me before I hit the stone. His hands were warm. That was the first thing I registered through the fog of pain. Startlingly, almost shockingly warm, even through the layers of fabric between us. And the moment his hands closed around my arms, something happened that I had not expected at all. The pain eased. Not completely, not immediately, but a fraction of the crushing weight lifted, as if someone had opened a window in a sealed room and let in the first breath of air. I had read enough about guide alpha dynamics to understand what was happening on a theoretical level. Kalian Voss was an S-class Esper, arguably the most powerful in the Empire, whose ability to perceive and generate massive fields of Esper energy had been slowly fracturing his own mind for years because he had no compatible guide to ground him. I was, apparently, his assigned mate, his compatibility match, which meant that my guide ability, whatever rank it was in this body, was calibrated specifically to him. And his proximity was doing something to my deteriorating body that no amount of warmth or medicine had managed in the days I had apparently been traveling. I heard him say something. His voice was low and clipped, the voice of a man who was not accustomed to being surprised, and he was very clearly surprised. I could not parse the words. My vision was narrowing at the edges, but I caught the shift in his posture, the way he adjusted his grip, and then he was lifting me, actually picking me up with a complete lack of ceremony that would have been offensive under any other circumstances, and carrying me away from the snow. I let him. There was not much choice. But as my head dropped against his shoulder and my consciousness began to slip, I made myself remember one thing with absolute clarity. In the novel, Duke Kilian Voss was not the villain because he was cruel. He was the villain because he was afraid. Of his own power, of what a bond would cost him, of needing someone and losing them. He had been written as a man who had built his entire existence around never needing anything, because everything he had ever needed had eventually been taken from him. He had walked away from his assigned mate on page 1, not out of malice, but out of terror. And now, for reasons I did not yet understand, he had not walked away. I was going to figure out why. And then I was going to make absolutely sure neither of us died in the process. I slept for what felt like a very long time. When I woke, I was in a room that was warmer than anything I had experienced since arriving in this world. Stone walls draped in heavy tapestries of dark blue and silver. A fire large enough to heat 3 ordinary rooms burning in the hearth to my left. Blankets layered over me with the practical thoroughness of someone who had been told to achieve warmth as an objective. The ceiling above me was high and vaulted, carved with House Voss's sigil, a wolf mid-leap with stars scattered across its flanks. I was in the palace guest wing, the good guest wing by the quality of the stonework. I turned my head carefully and found a man seated in a chair beside the bed. He was not Kalian Voss. He was perhaps 50, with a physician's careful hands and the kind of patient eyes that came from years of treating people who did not want to be treated. He noticed I was awake immediately. "How long?" I asked. My voice came out rougher than I expected. 3 days, he said. "The fever broke this morning. You were in considerable distress when His Grace brought you in. The cold had reached your lungs and you were severely weakened. Another hour in the courtyard and I suspect we would not be having this conversation. I absorbed that. 3 days unconscious." In the novel, the unnamed Omega had died the same night. I'd apparently bought myself 3 extra days simply by being conscious, long enough to look at Kilian Voss before passing out. "Is the Duke?" I started. The physician's expression shifted in a way I could not immediately categorize, something between professional caution and something softer. "His Grace has asked to be notified when you wake. I will send word now, if you are ready to receive him." I was not ready. I was lying in a borrowed bed in a body that was not mine, in a world that had tried to delete this body on page 1, and the most dangerous man in the Empire was apparently waiting to be told I'd open my eyes. I was approximately as far from ready as it was possible to be. "Yes," I said, "please tell him." The physician left. I used the time he was gone to take stock of what I knew and what I needed to know. I knew the bones of the political situation. The Empire was in a period of strained transition. Crown Prince Sylvian Ashvale, the novel's true protagonist, had just returned from a 3-year campaign in the Eastern Rifts and was moving to consolidate power before his aging father's formal abdication. Duke Kilian Voss, as the Empire's highest-ranked Esper and the commander of the Northern Territories, was technically an ally of the Crown, but had operated with near-complete autonomy for most of his adult life. Their relationship in the novel was complicated, built on mutual respect and mutual wariness. Kilian had no political ambitions of his own, but his power made him a piece that everyone on every side wanted to claim. I knew that the Imperial compatibility pairing system was both legally binding and deeply resented by powerful individuals who felt it reduced them to their biology. Killian had spent years trying to have the pairing dissolved. The paperwork had been blocked repeatedly, either through bureaucratic delay or because certain members of the Imperial Court had a vested interest in keeping the Duke destabilized and isolated. I knew that in the original novel, after the unnamed Omega's death, Killian Voss had gone into a controlled rampage that leveled half a border fortress and nearly killed 2 allied commanders before the Crown Prince had physically restrained him, at significant cost to himself. The novel had framed this as grief for a lost possibility, for a guide he had never allowed himself to have. It was the moment that cracked Killian's armor in the story, and allowed his eventual arc of reluctant alliance with Sylvian. I knew that the character whose body I now inhabited had never been named in the novel, which meant, technically, I could choose my own name. I had been thinking about this since the moment I realized where I was. My name in my previous life had been Soren. I liked that name. I was keeping it. The door opened. Killian Voss did not enter the way most people entered rooms. He did not knock. He did not pause at the threshold. He simply came in, the way weather comes in when you open a door to a storm. He had changed out of his traveling clothes into something more formal, dark wool and silver fastenings, though his black hair was still somewhat disheveled, as if he had run his hands through it recently and not bothered to correct the damage. He stopped at the foot of the bed and looked at me. I looked back. He was more unsettling up close than I had prepared myself for. In the novel he was described often, but somehow the text had not fully conveyed the specific quality of his attention. When Killian Voss looked at you, it was not a casual look. It was an assessment conducted with complete seriousness by someone who had survived a great deal by correctly reading everyone and everything around him. I wondered what he was reading in me. "You are awake," he said finally. His voice was precisely as it had been in the courtyard. Low, controlled. The voice of a man who chose each word the way a soldier chose terrain. "I am awake," I agreed. A pause. He seemed to be waiting for something. For anger, perhaps, or pleading. Both would have been reasonable responses from someone who had traveled weeks to reach the city, been turned away with a written note, and then nearly died in the snow outside the palace gates. I did not feel like performing either emotion right now. "I am Soren," I said instead, "since we have apparently not been properly introduced." Something crossed his face, too fast for me to name. He said nothing for a moment. "You changed your name," he said. I started. He had known the name in the Imperial pairing documents, the name of the person whose body this was. He had just confirmed it without any particular judgment in his voice. "I prefer Soren," I said carefully. "The other name did not suit me." Another pause. Then something that might have been the ghost of an acknowledgement in the slight shift of his jaw. Soren. He said the name as he had said it in the courtyard, testing its weight, and I felt the same thing I had felt then. A low vibration in the space between us, some harmonic resonance that neither of us was quite addressing yet. The guide alpha pole, the compatibility the Empire's pairing system had identified, and that he had spent years running from. "You should eat," he said. "The physician says you have not had solid food in 4 days." He turned toward the door, and I realized with a small lurch that he was going to leave, that this conversation had been as much as he was willing to offer right now. And if I let him walk out that door without addressing the actual situation we were in, I might not get another opening for days. "Duke Voss," I said. He stopped, did not turn around. "I know why you refused the pairing," I said. "I know what it costs you to have someone near you. I know what you can hear when your control slips and why the idea of a bond feels like putting a weapon in someone else's hands. I am not here to demand anything from you. I am not going to beg or plead or make this harder than it needs to be. I am here because I am your match and you are mine, and one of us was going to die without the other before very much longer." The silence in the room was total. Slowly he turned around. His gray eyes were very still, the kind of still that happened just before something massive moved. "How?" he said quietly. "Do you know that?" I met his gaze. I let a beat pass that was long enough to be honest. "I know many things about you," I said. "Some of them you have not told anyone. I cannot explain how I know them yet, and I am asking you to allow me some time before I try. But I want you to understand one thing clearly. I did not come here to die in your courtyard, and I did not survive 3 days of fever to be sent home with another polite note. His chest moved with a slow, controlled breath. "You are very direct," he said, "for someone who should still be resting." "I have a limited amount of time in which to be well rested," I said. "I intend to use the time I am awake productively." For one extraordinary moment, something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The idea of a smile seen from a distance. He walked to the chair beside my bed and sat down. "Someone will bring food," he said. "While you eat, you will tell me what you meant by that." I did not correct him about the order of operations. I let him have the command. It cost me nothing, and it told him something about me that I wanted him to know. I was not interested in fighting for dominance. I was interested in both of us being alive at the end of this story. The food came, brought by a silent attendant who took one look at the Duke seated beside the invalid Omega's bed, and managed to express approximately 17 layers of surprise with the back of their neck as they retreated. I ate carefully, aware of how my body was still recovering, and I talked between spoonfuls of broth about things I had no business knowing. I told him that his ability had been destabilizing for 3 years. I told him that the specific character of his Esper overload, the way it presented not as power loss, but as unwanted reception of the mental noise of everyone around him, was documented in his confidential medical assessments at the Imperial Esper Center, assessments that had been marked for his eyes only and that I could not have accessed through any ordinary means. I told him that the last time he had lost control completely had been 14 months ago, at the border fortress of Graval, when a combination of battle conditions and close proximity to a large civilian population had overwhelmed him to the point of partial rampage, and that the only reason the casualties had been limited was because he had managed to direct most of the output at the fortress wall, rather than the people inside. He went very still when I mentioned Graval. That information, he said, with a careful flatness that was clearly covering something much less flat, is classified at the highest level. There are perhaps 8 people in the Empire who know what actually happened at Graval. "I know," I said. "I told you I cannot explain my sources yet, but I need you to understand that I am not guessing and I am not performing. Everything I know about your situation is real, and what I know most clearly of all is that you have been running out of time. The overloads are getting more frequent. The periods of clarity between them are getting shorter. Without a stable guide bond, within the next 2 years, possibly sooner, you will reach a threshold you cannot pull back from." He said nothing. He was watching me the way I imagine he watched things he could not yet classify. "And you believe," he said, "that you are the solution to this." "I believe," I said carefully, "that I am the only compatible guide in the Empire for your specific frequency. The pairing system identified that 3 years ago. You have spent 3 years trying to make it not true. It is still true." I set down the empty bowl. The broth had steadied me more than I expected, and I could feel my body trying to do what a guide's body instinctively did in the presence of a compatible alpha. Orient, attune, offer. I was keeping that impulse on a very tight leash because the last thing Keelan Voss needed right now was to feel crowded. "I am not asking for a bond," I said. "Not now. Not until you want one, if you ever do. I am asking for proximity, for a chance to demonstrate that I can help stabilize your frequency without demanding anything from you in return. A trial period, whatever terms make you comfortable." His eyes had not moved from my face through any of this. "You said," he said slowly, "that you were not here to beg or plead. I said I was not going to beg or plead for what I wanted. I am absolutely willing to negotiate for what we both need." The ghost at the corner of his mouth appeared again, more substantial this time. "You are nothing like what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" He looked at me for a long moment. "Someone frightened," he said. "Someone smaller." "I was very frightened when I arrived," I said honestly. "I was cold and ill and alone, and I had just been told in writing that my presence was unwanted. But frightened and small are not the same thing." Something in his face changed, subtle, tectonic, the kind of shift that happened in foundations rather than surfaces. "No," he said quietly, "they are not." He stood. In the firelight, with his dark hair falling forward and the silver in his clothes catching the flame, he looked exactly like what he was in the novel, extraordinary and contained and carrying something vast inside him that he had never been permitted to put down. "You should sleep," he said. "Tomorrow, if you are recovered enough, I will show you the library. There are histories of the pairing system you may find useful." It was not exactly warmth, but it was the door left open. "It is enough," I told myself as he moved toward the exit. "It is more than the story gave him." He paused at the door. "Soren," he said, without turning around. "Yes. The next time you decide to nearly die on my doorstep." A very slight pause. Come inside first." He left before I could respond. I stared at the door for a moment, then at the fire, then at the carved wolves on the ceiling above me. He had made a joke. Approximately. In his own deeply restrained way, the villain of The Crown's Chosen had made a joke to the character who was supposed to die on page 1. I pressed my face into the pillow and felt something loosen in my chest that had been locked tight since I opened my eyes in the snow. I was going to survive this. More than that, I was going to make sure he survived it too. Because the novel had been wrong about Killian Voss from the very beginning, and I was the only person in this world who knew it. The library was 3 floors up, occupying an entire wing of the Eastern Palace that smelled of old paper and cedar oil and the particular kind of institutional permanence that came from centuries of someone caring very much about the preservation of knowledge. I arrived the next morning moving carefully, my legs still unsteady, wearing borrowed clothes that were slightly too large for the body I was inhabiting, and carrying the very clear internal awareness that I needed to be strategic about every impression I made in the next few weeks. Killian was already there. He was standing at one of the long reading tables with several volumes open in front of him, and a look on his face that suggested he had been there since before dawn. He glanced up when I came in, assessed my mobility with a single efficient sweep of his eyes, and pulled out the chair across from him without comment. I sat. He slid one of the open volumes toward me. "The historical taxonomy of compatibility pairings," he said. "If you intend to argue the case for our arrangement remaining in place, you will need to know the legal precedents." I looked at the volume, then at him. "You looked it up," I said. "I spent the night reviewing relevant documentation, yes." He said it with complete composure, as if this was perfectly ordinary behavior and not at all the action of someone who had been so unsettled by a conversation with an Omega he had never met that he had been unable to sleep. I did not say this. I pulled the book toward me and started reading. The morning passed in a silence that was not uncomfortable. Killian worked through his own materials. I worked through mine. Occasionally he would slide a document toward me without speaking, something relevant, something he thought I should see, and I would read it, and sometimes he would already be watching when I looked up, those gray eyes catching mine for a moment before he returned to his own pages. The guide alpha resonance between us was quieter in the daylight than it had been in the bedroom. More like a background awareness than a physical pull. I was grateful for that. It meant we could exist in the same room as 2 people, rather than as 2 halves of a system urgently trying to become one. Around mid-morning he spoke without looking up from his reading. "You said you could not yet explain how you know what you know about my situation," he said. "That is still true," I said. "But you intend to explain eventually." "Yes. When I have worked out how to do it in a way that will not make you think I am unstable." A pause. He turned a page. "You are sitting in a library in the capital city," he said, recovering from fever-induced collapse, negotiating a guide arrangement with a duke who has spent 3 years refusing one, and you are concerned I will think you unstable." I looked up. His eyes were still on his book, but there was something in the line of his mouth. "When you put it that way," I said. He turned another page. The corner of his mouth moved. "Take your time," he said. I went back to my reading. Outside the library windows, the capital was conducting its morning business in the snow, and somewhere in the palace, the story of The Crown's Chosen was continuing to unfold around us, its real plot gearing up, its true heroes preparing for the events that would define the Empire. And here in this library, the character who had been written off on page 1 was sitting across from the man who had supposedly let him die, reading legal precedents for guide alpha pairings and building something that in the novel had never imagined possible. It was not the story I had read, but I was beginning to think it might be better. The first time I guided him properly was an accident. We had been working in the library for several days. A careful, structured routine had established itself without either of us formally proposing it. Morning research, afternoon consultations with Killian's staff on territorial matters that he let me observe from a quiet corner, evenings where he worked late and I sometimes stayed and sometimes retired early, and depending on how my body was holding up. The recovery was slower than I would have liked. The fever had taken more out of this body than I had initially understood, and I was still sleeping more than I was accustomed to and tiring easily. But the proximity was working. I could feel it in the way Killian moved through the days and with slightly less of the contained tension I had noticed in our first meeting. Nothing dramatic. He was still entirely himself, controlled and precise, and radiating a focused authority that made his staff treat every doorway he passed through like a small event. But the sharp edge was fractionally softer. The particular quality of the stillness he carried, the stillness of something managing enormous force very carefully, had a degree more ease in it. He had not acknowledged this. I had not mentioned it. We were, unspoken agreement, being scrupulously practical about everything. Then one evening a message arrived from the Eastern Territories. I was in the library when a courier came in, moved directly to Killian with the specific body language of someone delivering news they did not want to deliver, and handed him a sealed document. I saw Killian read it. I saw the change in him that followed, not in his face. His face stayed completely still. But the air around him changed, the way air changes before lightning, a sudden atmospheric pressure that was not metaphorical in this world but entirely real. The courier retreated with considerable speed, a very wise choice. I stayed where I was. I kept my eyes on my book, and I monitored the quality of the energy in the room with the part of my awareness that had been slowly learning over the past several days what Killian's Esperfield felt like when it was stable versus when it was under stress. He was very much under stress. He stood at the reading table with a document in his hand for approximately 90 seconds. Then he set it down. His hands were flat on the table, and I could see from across the room that he was working very hard at something internal, at containment, at the basic act of keeping his own power on the right side of the threshold. I did not think. I stood up and walked to him. I did not touch him. I stopped a pace away, close enough that the guide resonance between us could do what it naturally wanted to do. And I simply existed in his proximity, and let my own system open slightly in the way that was, apparently, the entire point of what I was. The pressure in the room changed, not all at once, gradually. A controlled reduction, the way you vent pressure from a sealed system in careful increments rather than all at once. Killian's hands on the table uncurled. He did not look at me for a long moment. When he did, his gray eyes were still very dark, but the lightning quality was gone from them. The eastern border, he said. There have been incidents. I am sorry, I said. Do you need to respond tonight? He was quiet for a moment. No, tomorrow is soon enough. He looked at his hands, then at me. You came closer deliberately. Yes. Without being asked. Yes. He held my gaze. I held his. The resonance between us was steady and warm and present, in a way that was neither demanding nor fragile. You should not have to ask, I said. That is the entire point of this. The road north took 4 days in winter conditions, moving through a landscape that shifted from cultivated lowlands to something older and less tamed, ridges of dark pine, frozen river crossings, villages that grew smaller and more weathered the further north we rode. Killian set a pace that was efficient without being punishing. He checked on his riders at each stop with the practiced eye of someone who had pushed men too hard before and learned the cost. He also checked on me, not overtly. A glance at my posture in the saddle, a brief question about whether I needed to rest. On the second evening, we stopped at a way station that smelled of wood smoke and old stone. Killian took the room at the end of the hall, furthest from everyone else. I took the room beside it, which kept us within the guide resonance radius. I was almost asleep when I felt it. Not sound exactly. More like a change in the pressure of the air. The quality of static I'd learned to associate with Killian's Esperfield pushing against its own boundaries. I got up. I put on my coat. I knocked on his door with a specific quiet knock that says, I am not alarmed, but I am here. A pause. Then, come in. He was sitting at the small desk beside the window, dressed but clearly not having slept, with the look of someone who had been managing something difficult for a while. In the dim light, his black hair was loose from its usual restraint, and his gray eyes were darker than normal, the way they got when his field was active and struggling. I did not ask. I crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed nearest to him, close enough that my own awareness could open in the way that had become familiar to both of us over the past week. The static eased, gradually, the way it always did. He said nothing for a long moment. I said nothing either. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a sound like breathing. It is worse when I am tired, he said finally. The input. When my defenses are down, it comes in faster than I can filter it. Everyone in this way station, every dreaming mind, and every memory and fear and petty cruelty. He paused. You block it. Not the power itself, but the noise. You're like a wall between me and all of it. I know, I said. That is what a compatible guide does. He looked at me. In the firelight, with his face unguarded by the composure he wore so habitually during the day, he looked younger than the novel's villain had ever appeared in my imagination. He looked like someone who had been very tired for a very long time and had never been allowed to say so. How long has it been like this? I said carefully. The input. How long without real silence? Since I was 16, he said, when my ability manifested. The assessors told me the noise would become manageable with training. They were not entirely wrong. I became very good at managing it. He looked at his hands. But manageable is not the same as quiet. I've not had genuine quiet since I was 15 years old. Something tightened in my chest. Except, I said. He looked up. Except when I am near you. The word sat between us. Neither of us moved. I have been trying to determine whether that is real, he said slowly, or whether I have assigned significance to proximity because I want there to be a solution, and you are the nearest available candidate. Have you reached a conclusion? I said. His gray eyes were very steady on mine. Yes, it is real. I have been in the presence of every high-rank guide the Empire could provide. 9 official compatibility assessments. None of them produced this. He gestured with one hand, a small movement that encompassed the whole quality of the quiet between us. What you do is categorically different from anything I have experienced before. I know, I said again. You keep saying that. I keep meaning it. He was looking at me with that full, considered attention. The kind that did not flinch. Who are you, he said. Not as an accusation. As a genuine question. Who are you really, Soren, and how do you know the things you know? I've been waiting for this. I've been preparing for it since I first opened my eyes in the snow. I am going to tell you something, I said, that is going to sound impossible. I need you to listen to all of it before you respond. He nodded once. I took a breath. I am not originally from this world. I said, I come from a place where this world exists as a story, a written narrative. I had read it completely multiple times, and I knew it with the detail of someone who studied what they loved. When I woke here, I was in the body of a character who was written to die in the story's opening paragraph. A character with no name, no history, no future. And I decided that was not going to happen. Silence. I know what your medical assessments say, because in the version of this story I read, they were referenced in the narrative. I know about Graval because the novel described what happened there as a turning point in your arc. I know about the 3 court members blocking the dissolution paperwork because their scheming was part of the story's political structure. I know all of this because I read it in a book, and now I am inside that book, and I am trying very hard to make sure it ends differently than it was written to end. More silence. Kellyan was looking at me with an expression I could not read. Not disbelief. Not the particular stillness that preceded rejection. Something more careful than either of those things. In the version you read, he said at last, How did it end? I met his gaze. You lost control at Graval again, I said. Worse than before. The civilian casualties were significant. The Crown Prince pulled you back at considerable cost to himself. It started a process of reluctant trust between you that eventually produced something like an alliance, but it took years, and it was painful for everyone involved. You never bonded with a guide. You lived the rest of the story in careful management of something that was always one bad day away from catastrophe. And the character in my position died on page 1 and was never mentioned again. He absorbed this in silence. And you intend, he said slowly, to change this. I already have, I said. The character I am inhabiting is not dead. You did not walk away in the courtyard. Those are 2 changes the original story did not contain, and we made them in the first hours. Every day we have both been alive and functional, and working together is a day the story did not account for. Something moved through his expression, complex and deep, the way currents moved in very still water. If what you are telling me is true, he said, and I find that I believe you, which is itself extraordinary, then you came here knowing you were supposed to die. You came here knowing I was the one who was supposed to let it happen, and you chose to stay. You were standing there, I said. The man who was written as a villain, standing over someone the story had already discarded, and what I saw was not a villain. I saw someone exhausted and alone and terrified of needing something. I was not going to die to keep that narrative intact. The fire snapped in the grate. Outside, the pines breathed their cold breath against the walls. Kellyan stood. He moved to the window and stood with his back to me for a moment, looking at the dark line of the forest, and I'd let him have the silence, because this was a great deal to carry, and he had always, as far as I could tell, been required to carry great things alone. Then he turned around. In the novel, he said carefully, was there any version of this? Of what is between us? Was it there at all? No, I said. It was not. The story moved past it on the first page and never looked back. He crossed the room. He stopped in front of me, close enough that the guide resonance between us was vivid and warm, and he looked down at me with those gray eyes that were not the eyes of a villain and had never been the eyes of a villain, only the eyes of a person who had been written as one by someone who had not looked carefully enough. "Then we are already in a story that has not been written," he said. "Yes," I said. "Good," he said. "The written version sounds exhausting." And for the first time since I had arrived in this world, Duke Kilian Voss smiled. Not the ghost of a smile, not the intention of one seen from a distance. A real smile, unexpected and unguarded, and it changed his face the way sunrise changes a landscape, revealing everything that the darkness had been keeping from view. I felt something shift permanently in my chest. We were not in the original story anymore. We were in something new, uncharted, full of risks the novel had never mapped and possibilities it had never imagined, and I found, looking up at the man who had been written to walk away and had chosen not to, that I was not frightened at all. Graval announced itself 2 days later as a darkness on the horizon that resolved into a fortified settlement built against a ridge of black granite, its walls older than the Empire and its gates wearing the accumulated repairs of generations that had lived close to the place where the world's membrane thinned. The rift zone began 3 miles to the north, marked by the particular quality of the air, a faint metallic taste, and a pressure behind the eyes that I felt even without asperability. He had been quieter as we approached. Not cold, nothing like the controlled distance of our early days. More like a soldier who had been hearing a battle in the distance for hours, and was now hearing it get closer. I rode beside him and kept my own awareness open and steady, and let the guide resonance do what it did. Commander Aldrich met us at the garrison gate. He was a broad, weathered man in his 50s, with the direct eyes of someone who had spent a career making decisions in difficult conditions. He looked at Kilian with the complex expression of someone who respected a person, and was also slightly afraid of them. He looked at me with open curiosity. Kilian said my name and my function with minimal ceremony: Soren, guide. Aldrich absorbed this without comment. The situation in the garrison's command room was worse than the message had conveyed. The rift zone had expanded northward by approximately half a mile in 6 weeks, a rate with no historical precedent in this region. 2 outposts had been abandoned. The civilian population of the nearest village was currently housed inside the garrison, frightened and crowding everyone, and there were reports of a second rift opening several miles to the east, which would mean the zone was not just expanding, but fragmenting. Kilian listened to all of this with complete stillness. I watched him take it in and felt the field building and held my own awareness steady against the rise of it. "What is the immediate threat to the garrison?" he said. "If the northern expansion continues at its current rate," Aldrich said, "we lose the outer wall in 2 weeks. Kilian's jaw tightened. I felt it in the field before I saw it in his face. "Then we are not waiting 3 days for the Crown survey team," he said. They spent the next hour working through the tactical specifics. I stayed at the table and listened and built as complete a picture as I could of what we were walking into. In the novel, Kilian had gone to the rift zone alone the first time, and the combination of proximity to the raw energy and the mental noise of the frightened garrison had overwhelmed his defenses faster than he had anticipated. The margin between control and catastrophe had been razor thin. This time I was going to be there. I told him this after dinner when we were alone in the room Aldrich had assigned to us, which contained 2 narrow beds and a fire and the smell of pine resin and old stone. He looked at me when I said it. "You are not Esper-rated," he said. "I am guide-rated," I said. "That is different. The rift energy does not interact with guide abilities the way it does with Esper abilities. I will not be destabilized by proximity to it. You could still be harmed. Yes, so could you. More specifically, in the version of this story I read, you were harmed. Significantly, because you went alone." He was quiet for a moment. "In the morning," he said finally. "We approach the northern perimeter at dawn. Stay within 3 paces of me at all times. If I tell you to move back, you move back immediately without argument. I can agree to 2 of those 3 conditions," I said. He gave me a look that was not quite exasperated and not quite amused and contained elements of both. "The third," he said, "if you tell me to move back and I calculate that moving back will result in you losing the anchor and going over the threshold," I said, "I am not going to move back. I am going to stay precisely where I am, and we are going to get through it together." "You are the most argumentative guide the Empire has ever produced," he said. "I am the only guide the Empire has ever produced for you specifically," I said. "I suspect that accounts for the difference." A pause. And then that smile again, smaller this time and carrying something that was not quite vulnerability but was adjacent to it. "Sleep," he said. "We need to be up before the garrison." I simply lay down on my narrow bed and kept my awareness at the low, open frequency that seemed to quiet the input he was receiving, and listened to his breathing gradually slow across the room, and felt the particular satisfaction of being useful in a way that no one had ever anticipated, and the story had never described. We went to the rift zone at dawn, the sky the color of cold iron and the frost cracking under every step. Killian moved with the focused quiet of a man walking towards something he had faced before and was not careless about. At the edge of the active zone, everything sharpened. Killian extended his field. I felt it happen, felt the scale of it, so much larger than anything he had deployed in the library or the way station. This was the full measure of what he was. S-Class Esper, the Empire's most powerful active field operator, working at close to his actual capacity. The noise came with it. I felt the leading edge of the input, the flood of mental static from every mind in the surrounding area, from the garrison behind us and the frightened, displaced villagers inside it and the soldiers on the wall, and every dreaming and waking presence within the range of his expanded field. I opened my own awareness completely, not the careful, measured frequency of the past 2 weeks. Everything, every bit of the guide ability that this body carried, which I had been learning the boundaries of gradually and carefully and now simply released without reservation. The noise stopped. Not reduced, not managed. It stopped. The way a storm stops when you move inside a very solid structure and close the door. I heard Killian's breath catch. Then I heard him work. What he did at the stress point in the rift membrane took 40 minutes. I held the anchor through all of it, standing at his left side while he conducted his assessment with the precision of a surgeon, reading the structure of the rift, mapping the exact frequencies of its expansion, identifying the point where its membrane was thinnest. When he finally withdrew his field, he was pale with effort, and his breathing was controlled with the specific care of someone managing exhaustion. But his eyes, when he looked at me, were clear. The lightning quality was entirely absent. "I know where it is weakest," he said. "There's a point approximately a quarter-mile northeast where the membrane is stressed at a structural fault. If it is reinforced there, the expansion will slow. But the scale requires more energy than I have available after this assessment. I need additional Esper resources before we can address it directly. But you know what needs to be done." "Yes." "That is enough for now," I said. He looked at me with an expression stripped back by effort. "You did not move," he said. "No. For the entirety of that, you held the anchor. You did not tire." "I was not the one extending a field into an active rift zone," I said. "You did the difficult work." He shook his head. "In every previous case of my field overextension at a rift site, the input destabilized me within 20 minutes, 15 in conditions like these." He looked at the gray sky, then back at me. "I had 40 minutes of clear thought because of you. That is not a small thing, Soren." "I know," I said. He reached out, and with a deliberateness that was entirely unlike the accidental brushes and functional contacts of the past 2 weeks, he took my hand. Not for grounding, not for guiding. Just the simple act of one person holding another person's hand in the cold at the edge of a rift zone in the early morning light. I looked at our joined hands. His were broader than mine, warm in the specific, startling way I'd first noticed in the palace courtyard. "Thank you," he said. I turned my hand and held his back, and we stood at the edge of the broken place and let the thing that had been growing between us since the beginning exist in the daylight without either of us trying to manage it. Crown Prince Sylvian arrived with his survey team on the 3rd day. He saw me standing beside Killian, and something in his expression went warm and satisfied. "It appears," he said to Killian, "that you have not sent your guide home yet." "It appears," Killian said, "that my guide has not given me a functional opportunity to do so." Sylvian looked at me. "I like you," he said. "I know," I said. The survey team's assessment confirmed Killian's reading. The structural situation was a stress fracture in the local membrane propagating along a fault line running northeast to southwest. Left unaddressed, the two sites would merge into a single large zone that could not be stabilized from outside. The timeline for that merger was approximately 3 weeks. The room was very quiet after the geomancer finished speaking. "What we need," Killian said, "is to address the stress point at the primary zone's northeast fault. If it can be reinforced before the corridor fully establishes, it would interrupt the propagation. With support, yes. Not alone." Sylvian looked at me. Killian also looked at me. "Tell me what you need from me," I said. In the evening after the briefings, Killian came to find me where I was sitting on the garrison wall watching the northern sky. He sat beside me, close enough that the guide resonance was present and warm between us. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," I agreed. The northern sky in winter had a particular quality of darkness, denser and more absolute than the sky further south, lit only by stars that looked very close and very cold. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what you told me, about the story, about the original version of events. In that version there was no one, no guide, no anchor, and the consequence was what happened at Graval. What almost happened again this time. Yes. And in that version," he said carefully, "you did not exist past the first page. The character whose body you inhabit was gone before the story truly began." "Yes." He turned to look at me. His gray eyes in the starlight were very clear. "I have been thinking about what that means," he said. "That you are here, that you decided to stay, that you could have simply accepted what the story said about you and you chose not to." "I was not going to lie down and disappear," I said. "Not for narrative convenience." "No," he said, "you were not. I spent 3 years refusing the pairing because I had convinced myself that needing a guide was a weakness I could not afford, that the cost of a bond, of being known that completely by another person, was too high." He paused. I had been alone with the noise for so long that I had stopped being able to imagine an alternative. "And now," I said carefully. "Now," he said, "I'm trying to remember what silence actually felt like. When I was 15 and the ability had not yet come in. I cannot fully remember it anymore. 15 years is a long time, but I think it felt something like this. Like right now." "Killian," I said. He looked at me. "I need to tell you something I should have said more clearly earlier. I said I was not here to demand anything from you. That is still true, but I want you to understand that what I feel about this, about being here with you, about what has been building between us since the first day, is not strategic, and it is not manufactured by the guide resonance. And it is not something I am doing because the story requires it." He was very still. "I did not survive page 1 and travel north to a rift zone in winter because I was performing a role," I said. "I am here because you are worth being here for. The person I have watched for these past weeks. The person who checks his writer's condition at every stop and makes space for silence in a conversation without filling it, and smiled at me in a way station in the middle of the night, as if he had not smiled in a very long time. That person. I am here for him. Not for a narrative arc, not out of obligation to a compatibility pairing. For him." The silence stretched. Then Killian reached out, and with the same deliberateness with which he had taken my hand at the rift zone, he touched my face. One hand, careful and warm, against my cheek. "I've been trying not to want this too much," he said, his voice very low, "because I have wanted things before and had them taken, and I am not as good at losing things as people assume." "I know," I said. His thumb moved slightly against my cheekbone. "I do not want to be careful with you," he said. "That is what frightens me. I have been careful with everything for so long. With you, I keep finding that I want to simply be present instead of managed." "Then be present," I said. He leaned forward and pressed his forehead against mine, and the guide resonance between us, which had been steady and warm, became something deeper and more settled, the way a river becomes something quieter and more powerful after it passes through the narrowest part of its channel. We sat on the garrison wall in the northern night, with our foreheads together and the stars very close above and tomorrow's difficult work waiting for us, and I thought about the novel and about the character on page 1 and about how very far we had come from that beginning, further than any page had ever taken us, into territory that had no written map and no predetermined ending. It was the best feeling I had ever had in any world I had ever lived in. Tomorrow came with cold, clear air and the kind of focused quiet that preceded serious work. The team assembled at the garrison gate before full light, Callian and the 2 additional espers, Sylvian, Petra with her instruments, and me. We moved through this winter landscape toward the primary rift zone in a formations Killian had worked out the previous evening. At the edge of the active zone, everything sharpened the way it had before. The metallic taste, the pressure, the particular empty stillness of somewhere something had departed from and left wrong. Killian extended his field, this time at full capacity with intent. I opened my own awareness completely. The noise stopped. And he worked. 47 minutes. I counted them, not with clinical intent, but because counting was something to do with the part of my mind that was not wholly occupied with holding the anchor. 47 minutes of precise, sustained, high-output Esper work, while I stood at his left side and held the door closed against the noise and let him be, for the first time in 15 years, simply a person doing something difficult without the whole world's inner life pressing in on him at every moment. When it was done, he lowered his field slowly in graduated stages, and I matched him, drawing my own awareness back by increments as the external world came back in managed amounts. He stood still for a moment when it was fully complete. Then he turned to me, and his face was exhausted and open and carrying an expression I had never seen on it before, pure, unguarded relief. "Done," he said. Petra was already verifying with her instruments. "The fault line," she said without looking up, "has stopped propagating. The stress fracture is stable." She paused. "It is actually stable?" Sylvian, standing slightly behind us, exhaled. Kalian did not look at Petra or Sylvian. He was still looking at me. "You did not move back," he said. "I told you I would not," I said. He looked at me for another moment. Then, in full view of the Crown Prince and the survey team and Petra with her instruments, he took both of my hands in his. "I want," he said, with the careful precision of a man who meant every word, "to discuss the terms of a formal bond when you are ready, and on whatever timeline makes sense to you. Not because the pairing system requires it, not because the Empire needs it, because I want to spend whatever years I have ahead of me with the silence you give me, and the argument you bring to every room, and the particular way you say yes to things that are genuinely difficult and no to things that are easy." "I am going to need a moment," I said, "because I have spent a great deal of time thinking about what it would take to keep both of us alive, and I had not allocated sufficient mental space to what came after." He smiled. The real one, unreserved and unguarded, the sunrise smile that changed everything. "Take your time," he said. I looked at our joined hands and at the rift zone that was no longer expanding and at the gray winter sky above Graval beginning, very slowly, to lighten towards something that might eventually become blue. "Yes," I said. "I will discuss it with you. Whenever you are ready, I am ready." His hands tightened around mine. We walked back through the frost together, the rift zone stable behind us and the road ahead unwritten, and the story going somewhere nobody had predicted. Sylvian stayed for a week after the intervention. On his last evening, he found me alone in the garrison library. "There are 3 court members who have been obstructing the dissolution of the pairing," he said, sitting down across from me. "I know who they are. I have been collecting documentation for 8 months. I was waiting for the right moment to move against them, which required Kalian to be stable enough that their removal would not also destabilize him." He slid a sealed document across the table. "The circumstances have changed considerably in the past 2 weeks. The vulnerability of those 3 we're exploiting no longer exists. I wanted you to know first so that you could judge the right moment to tell him." "Why me?" I said. "Because," he said simply, "you know him better than anyone in this empire, including me." I told Kalian about the document that evening. He read it in silence. He read it twice. Then he set it down. "They have been obstructing," he said, "deliberately, for 2 years. For political advantage." His voice was flat with the specific flatness of someone auditing damage. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "I spent 2 years trying to dissolve that pairing," he said. "I thought it was bureaucratic inefficiency. I redesigned the application twice. They created the conditions for you to nearly die in my courtyard. Yes." The quality of his stillness shifted. "Sylvian has documentation," he said. "Sufficient for action, yes. Then let him act." He stood. He moved to the window, the familiar profile in the evening light, and I waited and let him process it at his own pace. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. I looked at him. "The letter I sent," he said. "The one that told you your presence was unwanted. That was not what I intended to communicate. What I intended was to make the situation clear. What I communicated was something considerably crueler, and I have been aware of that since I read the letter again after you arrived." "I know," I said. "You know. I know what you intended. I know what the letter said. I know the difference between the two, and I know which one you actually are." He turned from the window. His gray eyes in the lamplight were very direct. "You are remarkably difficult to remain appropriately guilty around," he said. "I am not trying to make it easier," I said. "I am trying to make it accurate. You are operating under deliberate sabotage, limited information, and 15 years of being trained to keep everyone at a distance. You made a choice based on all of that which caused genuine harm. It is worth acknowledging. It is also worth not reconstructing your entire understanding of yourself around it. He looked at me for a long moment. Where did you come from? He said. A different world, I said, where I read about you and thought the story had gotten you wrong. His mouth curved. And now, he said, now I know it did. He crossed the room and stopped in front of me, tilting my face up with one hand. I have been thinking, he said, about the bond discussion we tabled. Both of us survived Graval, I said. I told you I would be ready when you were. I am ready, he said. If you are? I was, I said, ready, approximately 4 days into our acquaintance. I simply did not want to alarm you by saying so. The sunrise smile, unhurried and complete. He bent his head and kissed me. Not for the first time. The way station had contained its own private precedents, but for the first time without either of us holding back. The way you finally put down something heavy once you are certain you've reached the place you were carrying it to. The bond settled between us not with a dramatic ceremony, but with the quiet of two frequencies finding the same pitch, a deepening of the resonance that had been building since the moment his hands caught me in the snow of the palace courtyard, a warmth that was not metaphorical. I leaned into him and felt the bond take hold and felt something I had no prior vocabulary for. The experience of becoming someone's anchor, not as a function or a role, but as a fact, as permanent and unremarkable as gravity. He exhaled against my hair. Something long held releasing. I felt it in the bond, in that specific unwinding, the way a fist opens when it finally has permission to stop holding on. He had been braced against the noise for so long that the absence of it was its own kind of shock, a stillness so complete he had to relearn how to simply exist inside it. I lifted my head and looked at him. His eyes were closed. The lines around them, the ones carved by 15 years of managing something enormous alone, had not disappeared, but they had eased. He looked like a man setting down a weight he had stopped noticing was there. The silence, he said very quietly. Complete. Yes. His arms tightened. Months later, when the court proceedings had concluded, and the 3 obstructing members had been removed from their positions by imperial order, Killian and I walked the grounds of his northern estate as the first real warmth of early spring found its way through the evergreens. Stone and old wood, and a library I had catalogued with a degree of enthusiasm that Killian had observed with what I now recognize as genuine fondness. He walked beside me with his hand in mine, a habit that had settled into us without either of us proposing it, and the bond between us was warm and as ordinary as breathing. How does it feel? I asked. Thinking of the things he had told me in the way station, in that quiet early conversation in about 15 years of noise, he was quiet for a moment. The good kind of quiet. Like myself, he said. I feel like myself. I'd forgotten what that was. He stopped walking. He turned to face me fully, standing in the thin early warmth of the spring light with the estate's old stone at his back and the evergreens behind him. And he looked at me, the way he had looked at me, in the garrison room when I told him who I was and where I came from, with that complete, unhurried attention that did not flinch and did not perform. I think, he said slowly, that I had also forgotten what it felt like to want something, without already preparing for its loss. I know, I said. His mouth curved. You always know. I always mean it, I said. I looked at him in the pale spring light, black hair loose and the habitual tension entirely absent from the line of his shoulders, and felt the bond hum gently between us, and thought that whatever world I had come from, and whatever story had first put us both into motion, this was the version that had always been possible. Not easy, not without cost, but possible. The story it should have been from the beginning. The garden was very still. Somewhere in the forest beyond the estate wall, a bird was doing its optimistic best with the new season. The rift zones in the north were stable and monitored. The crown prince was conducting the business of the empire with his characteristic organized efficiency. The 3 court members who had spent 2 years engineering one person's loneliness for political advantage were facing consequences proportional to what they had done. Killian paused at the edge of the garden path. He tilted his head slightly, listening, and I knew without asking what he was doing, testing the quiet, checking whether it was still there. It had become a small habit of his in the weeks since the bond settled, that brief moment of stillness where he simply listened to the absence of the noise and let himself believe it was permanent. He looked at me. The corner of his mouth moved. Still there, he said. Still there, I agreed. And here, in the small and specific world of 2 people who had found each other by accident and chosen each other deliberately, The morning was as ordinary and as extraordinary as every morning before it had been. I had transmigrated, as the character the story threw away. I'd ended up with a story worth telling. It turned out those were the same thing. If you enjoyed the story, please like, share, and subscribe. It truly helps the channel grow. My beautiful heaven angels, tell me your thoughts in the comments. Which part did you like the most, and where can I improve? I love reading and replying to your comments. It means the world to me. Let's meet again next time with a better story. Until then, I hope you all have a great time.